So, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the U.S. Human Rights Network for our Engaging the Upcoming U.S. Review under the Torture Convention. This is Rebecca Landy from the U.S. Human Rights Network, and I just want to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded. So, without further ado, we will get started, and thanks everyone for joining. So just to give you a little bit of background, for those of you not familiar, the U.S. Human Rights Network is a national network of organizations and individuals working to strengthen and grow a human rights movement and culture in the United States, led by the people most directly impacted by human rights violations. It's a people-centered movement. Today's speakers are Claire Leslie Johnson, who is at the Human Rights Program at the University of Minnesota and the CAT Task Force co-chair. And I'm actually going to now give the mic over to Claire to moderate for the rest of the call. So Claire, please go ahead if you can unmute yourself, and thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. We're really grateful to have the list of presenters that we have here. Quite a few people were able to join and provide us with their insights on doing advocacy before the Committee Against Torture, and I think we have a really good lineup, and we'll have a lot of great insights today. So actually, why don't we move to the agenda slide, and I can do introductions based on that slide. Thank you. First of all, we're going to have Joe Natas, the CAT Secretariat. We're so grateful he could join us this morning. He'll just speak for a few minutes to start, and then we'll have a very brief Q&A for anyone who has questions for Joe, simply because he's on a totally different time schedule from us, and we don't want to keep him too late. Then we'll have a history and overview of the convention presented by Melina Milazzo at the Center for Victims of Torture. And then we'll move into an overview for how to utilize the convention for advocacy. We'll discuss shadow reports and advocacy in Geneva, and we'll have Nicole Borelli and Rebecca Landy give that presentation. And then finally, we're really excited to have Joey Mogul at the People's Law Office, who will provide an overview of how she and her group use the Committee Against Torture and the CAT mechanism to advance their cause and do advocacy on the Chicago police torture cases. And finally, my co-chair, Antonio Giannata, for the CAT Task Force, will moderate Q&A. I think hopefully we'll have about 25 minutes for the Q&A portion at the end, when we can take more of your questions. So with that being said, Joa, I'm going to pass it off to you. Go ahead. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, hello, good afternoon to everyone. My name is Joan Natas. I'm the Secretary of the Committee Against Torture. I would like to thank you all for this invitation. We very often have this kind of meeting with the NGO here in Geneva. Of course, I understand that this is not very easy to do with the US NGO, so I think I'm grateful to have this opportunity to brief you a little bit on the proceedings before the committee. On the website of the committee that I hope most of you are familiar with, you will have additional information on how actually NGOs can engage with the committee. First of all, I would like to say that the committee has always very much appreciated information provided by NGOs with regards to the reports that it has before it. The US will be before the committee at this November session between the 3rd and the 28th November. The final program of work has not yet been defined, but most likely the US report will be before the committee on the second week of the session. The program will probably be finalized by the end of this week or the beginning of next, and it will be available on the website, and you will be able to know exactly on which days and at what exact timing the proceedings will be. Generically speaking, the review of a country starts by a private meeting that the committee hosts with NGOs. This is done on the eve of the first day of the consideration of the reports. Usually it's between noon, 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock in the afternoon. All NGOs that have submitted a written information to the committee are invited to participate to this briefing. This briefing lasts approximately 1 hour. It is divided in two parts. A first part where the NGOs will present orally the main issue they want to raise to the committee. They should not repeat the information they have provided in writing, but just to highlight a few of the issues they consider to be the most important. When there are a lot of NGOs coming before the committee, as I guess it will be the case with the US, half an hour is very limited. So I would strongly suggest that you consolidate your presentations in 1 or 2 or 3 speakers. That would allow for a smoother presentation. That, of course, implies the fact that you have to coordinate yourself. As you know, OMCT, and I see that Nicole will also be participating in this webinar, will tell you more about it, and we'll give you some details on how to do this in a smooth way. The second part of this 1 hour briefing will be for Q&As, meaning that after listening to your presentations, the members of the committee, including the rapporteurs, will be asking questions to you in order either to clarify some of the issues or for you to be more precise or to update some information. So this will be your interaction, your interaction with the committee. First of all, written reports that have to be submitted to the committee, and actually the deadline is 2 weeks before the session, but this information, I don't want to bother you with it. It's all available on the website, and Nicole most probably will inform you about that. Then the second part of the proceedings are the public sessions where the committee meets the delegation. A first morning from 10 to 12, where the delegation will be before the committee. The delegation will actually present its opening statement, and then the rapporteurs and the members of the committee will ask questions to the delegation. This is a public session. NGOs can obviously participate as observers, but only as observers. And then the following day, which will be, let's say, the third part of the what we call the interactive dialogue, will be when the delegation of the state party will be coming back to the committee with the answers of the questions that were asked by the rapporteurs and by the members on the previous day. And that will be in an afternoon from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. Well, in a nutshell, this is the proceedings before the committee. I understand that some of you have been already know these proceedings because they have participated to the previous consideration of the US a few years ago, and I am available now to answer to more questions you might have. To be more specific, on the second day of the dialogue, it will be divided more or less in two parts. The first part of answers for about 1.5 hours, where the delegation will answer to the questions, and then there will be follow-up questions and follow-up answers. This is for the more detail, but I think this is of less importance to you. What is important to you is that on the day of the briefing, you will be able to raise with the committee the most important issues. Not all of them, because all of them will have been presented in writing, but the most important one that you want to attract the attention of the committee. So I don't want to be too long. I'm still available for any clarification you might need. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so helpful. Joa is just going to be able to answer a few questions right now. We'll have a longer Q&A at the end of the webinar, but we don't want to make him stay on the line, so we're just giving you all a moment to ask questions. If you have them, you can either type them in the chat box to everyone, or you can raise your hand, and you do that if you're on your computer by going to My Mood at the top, and then you scroll over that, and then there's a raise your hand button. If not, the network can also field questions and ask Joa about them, and then report back to all the webinar attendees. Okay, I don't see anyone's hand raised at this time or any questions. I'll just wait one more second because sometimes it can take a moment for them to come through. Okay, so I think we'll just go ahead and continue because we have a pretty packed agenda, but I just want to thank Joa again so much for attending. We really appreciate your insight into the work of the committee, and we look forward to working with you for the upcoming review. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. If you want, and if there will be further questions or other questions close to the end of this webinar, I can come back online to answer them if you want, not to wait now for 1 hour. So if you want, just send me an email and I will connect again with you later on if there are questions that you want me to answer. Otherwise, thank you very much for inviting us to participate on this webinar.
Wonderful. That sounds great. I'll let you know if we have any further questions for you later. And thank you so much again.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye. Claire, I'll turn it back over to you to moderate and introduce Melina.
Yeah, so now we're going to back up a little bit and ask Melina to give us some more context and background on the CAT convention. So Melina, I'll pass it over to you. Melina's the Senior Policy Counsel at the Center for Victims of Torture. She's a member of the CAT task force, and she's been a huge help on the task force. We're really grateful to have her. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Claire. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody. And as Claire mentioned, I'll be giving a very general overview of the committee itself, a brief history of the committee's review of the United States, and then I'm going to give a general overview of how the Convention Against Torture defines torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment. So with that, if we can go to the first slide, please. So the Committee Against Torture is the body of 10 independent experts that monitors the implementation of the Convention Against Torture by its state parties. All state parties must submit regular reports to the committee on how the treaty is being implemented. States must report initially 1 year after ratifying the convention, and then every 4 years. The committee examines each report and addresses its concerns and recommendations to the state party in the form of concluding observations. Next slide, please. And as we heard earlier by the CAT Secretariat, the committee also invites civil society to submit shadow reports to either add or to correct information that was provided by state parties. And more, we'll get a little bit further along into what exactly that means later on in the presentation. But civil society will also or can also have an opportunity to brief the committee members in person. And as we heard in Geneva, there will be an opportunity to do so in the NGO briefing. The committee then takes all this information that's provided by the state parties, by the government officials and civil society, and then it conducts an in-person hearing with the governments on treaty compliance. Next slide, please. So that was just a general overview of the committee itself, and now I just want to give a brief history of the United States' review before the committee. And by way of background, the Convention Against Torture was adopted in December of 1984. It came into force on June 26, 1987. The U.S. signed the Convention Against Torture in 1988 and ratified it in 1994. As I mentioned, normally the United States should have reported 1 year after it had ratified the convention, but it submitted its reports late, and so it was first reviewed by the committee in 2000. At the time, this was pre-9/11, and so the hearing mostly focused on domestic issues. The second review, which took place in May 2006, the United States was intensely scrutinized because of the much publicized and criticized actions during its so-called war on terror. In 2010, the committee issued a list of issues for the United States to address. The U.S. responded to those issues in its most recent report to the committee on August 12, 2013. And the committee will conduct its in-person hearing with the United States in Geneva in November 2014, as we heard earlier. So this will be the third time that the United States is being reviewed by the committee. We can move on to the next slide. Now I want to give, once again, a very general overview of how the Convention Against Torture defines torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishment. And I mean, we could have a whole webinar just on this itself. So again, this is a very general overview. And before I begin, it's important to note that torture is not an act in itself or specific type of acts, but it's a legal qualification of an event or a behavior, and it's based on a comprehensive assessment of this event or behavior. So Article 1 of the Convention defines torture. It's a lengthy definition, so I won't read it here, but I recommend everyone to please read it. But for our purposes today, what I've done is I've broken down the definition to sort of the four most essential elements for an act to constitute the legal definition of torture under the Convention. So first, the act or omission of an act, for example, depriving someone of food, sleep, etc., must rise to the level of severe pain or suffering, and this can be physical or mental. Second, the act must be intentionally inflicted on a person and cannot be inherent in or incidental to lawful sanctions. Third, the act must be for the purpose of either obtaining information or a confession, for punishing or intimidating, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind. And finally, there has to be some link to the involvement of public officials. And so the way that the Convention defines this is that the act must be inflicted by or at the instigation of or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or other person acting in an official capacity. We can move on to the next slide, please. So in addition to the Convention prohibiting torture, the Convention also, in Article 16, prohibits other acts of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment which do not amount to torture, but when such acts are committed by or at the instigation of or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or other person acting in an official capacity. So again, there has to be that same link to the involvement of public officials. The definition is not that clear. It doesn't actually define what is the sort of level, what's the nature of the act in terms of that it would rise to the level of CID treatment. And sometimes it can be really difficult to distinguish. And if we can go to the next slide, what I've tried to do is just sort of in this next slide is just kind of let you know that it's the difference between torture and CID treatment is sometimes difficult to distinguish. The difference between torture and CID depends on the specific circumstances of each case, and it's not always obvious. Sometimes the specific intensity or nature of certain acts may readily qualify it as an act of torture. However, in some others, the vulnerability of the victim, whether it's the age, gender, status, etc., as well as the environment, were they in detention custody or other forms of custody, and sort of the cumulative effect of various factors has to be taken into account to determine whether an act amounts to torture or whether it should be considered as cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. So it's not as easy. There's a lot of jurisprudence, both in sort of the international tribunals and international law and regional mechanisms that will sort of lay out a little more about what acts have constituted torture or CID treatment in the past. And it's more important, I think, just to recognize that the legal definition of torture for purposes of the convention really just have to meet those four elements in order to be prohibited under the convention, and in which state parties then have obligations that rise from that. And that's all I have.
Thanks, Melina. That was really helpful. It's a really helpful reminder for all of us, and I think an introduction for many of us as well. Now we're going to move towards more of a discussion about how to utilize the Convention for Advocacy in the U.S. case. So we'll have Nicole and then Rebecca talk about shadow reporting and advocacy in Geneva before the committee. Starting with Nicole, who is the Human Rights Advisor for the World Organization Against Torture. Nicole, why don't you take it away?
Thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you very much for inviting me. I want to briefly address three things. First, I'd like to say something about OMCT's role in this process. And then I briefly explain the procedures before the CAT. This will repeat some issues Joe already mentioned. I'll go through briefly. And then I finally provide some ideas on how to approach shadow reporting, or some ideas, some issues. Next slide, please. OMCT's role is to facilitate between NGOs on the one hand and CAT members and Secretariat on the one hand. And this role was initiated upon the request of the Secretariat and the CAT. This means, first and foremost, that we try to ensure that there are no gaps in shadow reporting, and that we also organize and moderate the NGO lunch briefings that are held between NGOs and members of the CAT. And I come to this in a minute. I now come to my next slide. I briefly explain how the session proceeds. The first meeting is usually held in the morning. First, the state report will be considered. This means that the state delegation will present its report in 15 minutes, followed by questions by the two rapporteurs. They usually have 25 minutes each, and the first rapporteur addresses Articles 1 to 9, and then the second rapporteur Articles 10 to 16. And then this is followed by questions from other members of the committee, and this meeting is public. So that means NGOs can attend as observers. Then the lunch briefing, this is usually held before the state report is considered, or sometimes after. This is held between NGOs and members of the committee. As Raul mentioned, NGOs usually have 30 minutes to present their reports, and then the committee will ask questions. And if a lot of NGO delegations are attending, then ONCT will usually organize a pre-meeting in Geneva with the delegations, with the NGO members. And this is in order to make sure that a lot of things can be covered and that not everyone addresses the same issues, and just to make the most of it. And this meeting is private. This means that only committee members and only NGOs that submitted a shadow report can attend. And in the chat, I saw a question by someone who asked if this lunch briefing will be attended by all committee members, and usually not all committee members attend these lunch briefings. So the rapporteurs will attend, but not always all committee members will attend. Then on my next slide, usually the day after, in the afternoon, there's the replies of the party. The state has about 90 minutes to reply to the questions by the rapporteur and other committee members. And then after, committee members usually ask further questions, to which then the state replies again. And then this meeting is also public, so NGOs can attend to. Then on my next slide, all public sessions are live webcasted. So the considering of the state report and the reply of the state parties are webcasted. It can be found under a treatybodywebcast.org. Some NGOs use this as an advocacy tool and organize screenings at home for journalists, for instance, in order to foster knowledge, or also to increase the likelihood that journalists report on concluding observations, or just that they report on the fact that the US is before the committee. These videos are also archived. This means that you can look at past sessions, which could give you an idea of what kind of questions the committee asked and how the session proceeds. Then on my next slide, on shadow reporting, there are of course different ways to go about, and here are just a few tips. What can be useful is an analysis of the state report, because this is the basis of the committees and rapporteurs' recommendations and questions. It is important to identify gaps or misrepresented facts in the state report, and then provide the committee with alternative statistics and also specific cases. Committee members very frequently ask for statistics, and they also frequently ask the state for clarification with regard to concrete trade cases, and usually based on information they received from NGOs. So statistics and also concrete cases can be very helpful. Then on my next slide, what could also be helpful is an analysis of recommendations by other bodies with respect to the US. The committee in particularly refers to the UPR. In preparing a shadow report, or in arguing or substantiating one's report, one could also have a look at the committee's approach to different issues, which can be found on the two web pages I indicated. So recommendations can be found on the Human Rights Index. That will be the first link, and then views by the committee can be found under worldcourts.com. These databases can be searched using keywords. I found these very helpful. And then coming to my last slide already, irrespective of the country under review, the committee very frequently asks questions about the definition of torture and how the domestic definition is compatible with the definition in the convention. And there are also very frequently questions related to the OPCAT. So it could be helpful to provide your view and information on these topics, but of course depending on the focus of your report. And since two members of the CAT do not speak English, it could be helpful to provide a summary in French. And yeah, the deadline for a submission will be the 17th of October, so directly to the CAT. And if you have any further questions, you can ask them later on, or always contact me. And since we are organizing the lunch briefings, it would be very helpful if you could let me know early on if you plan on attending the CAT. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. That was really great. I think next we have Rebecca Landy, the Human Rights Outreach Coordinator for the U.S. Human Rights Network, who is going to expand a little bit on what Nicole went over with additional recommendations for how to engage in shadow reporting, and then also talk a little bit about how to collaborate with the U.S. Human Rights Network in advocacy before CAT. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Claire, and thank you again, Nicole. That was really helpful. So I'll kind of take a step back and talk a little bit about how you can organize your advocacy, and then I'll go into some more details about shadow reporting. So one thing that you can do in order to take part in the advocacy is you can join a working group. And we just posted on the U.S. Human Rights Network website a list of the CAT working groups. The groups may change a little bit, but if you're interested in joining one, please let us know. And the next slide will show a little bit more about these groups. But the working groups are really a great opportunity to work together to coordinate your efforts. You can work with other organizations who are working on a similar issue and perhaps write a collaborative shadow report. It's also an opportunity to advocate in Geneva, as Nicole said. And I think Joa as well, there's only a few minutes that each group has, so you work together to put a statement together for Geneva, and then you can also, your working group can advocate at home by doing things like having a screening of the CAT review that's taking place, as Nicole mentioned. So those are just a few ways that you can be a part of a working group. So right now, this is our list of working groups that the CAT Task Force helped put together, and there's CAT Task Force leads for all of these groups. And so we have a national security group, a general prison conditions group, an immigration detention and deportation group, issues affecting youth, police crimes, a right to rehabilitation for survivors of torture, death penalty, political incarceration, and issues affecting women and LGBTQ individuals. So if you're interested in joining one of those groups, and on the website there's a little bit more definition of what those groups, what issues those groups might entail, and if you feel like your group isn't included or what your issue isn't included in one of those groups, you can also contact us. And the email address is right here, and we'll also be sending out an email after the webinar to remind you of the contact information, but it's cat@ushrnetwork.org. So just to give you a little bit more information on the actual perimeters of shadow reporting, we ask that if you're writing just one organization or individual report, you try to limit it to 5 pages. The CAT Secretariat, the committee members are all volunteer, and they are going to be getting a lot of reports, so you don't want to bog them down with really lengthy reports, and they won't have time to read them. If you're working together with multiple organizations, as I mentioned before, which you can do through the working groups, so you don't need to, I don't know if I said this before, but you don't need to write a shadow report if you're a member of a working group. You can still take part in the advocacy as part of the working group. And you can also work together, and maybe one working group will have multiple organizations writing a few reports on distinct issues that fall within the working group. But we ask that if you're writing a multiple organization report, you try to limit it to 10 pages, and the committee won't accept reports that are longer than 15 pages. And it's really important that within your shadow report, you include links to existing websites, reports, and other sources. Especially because they're so brief, you really want to include those links to other information. So I try to lay out really briefly the 10 steps to writing a shadow report. And so I'll just, the next few slides will go over these 10 steps. You need to include a title and a date, the reporting organization. If you aren't writing a report, there's also opportunities to sign on to another organization's report. So you could be listed as a signatory, the issue summary, concluding observations, the government report, the legal framework, CAT Committee general comments and list of issues, other UN body recommendations, as Nicole mentioned, such as UPR, the recommended questions, and suggested recommendations. So here's just a few examples of some titles of reports, not necessarily CAT reports, but just to give you a sense of putting a title on your report. Here's one, the shackling of incarcerated pregnant women, a human rights violation committed regularly in the United States. You can also simply say something like, the United States compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights with respect to the continued detention without charge or trial of prisoners for an undefined duration at the Guantanamo Bay detention facility. So those are just a few sample titles from reports that have been submitted through the network in the past for other treaty bodies. So you want to make sure that you put all of the reporting organizations and partner names on your slide. So right here is an example of a report that was written and submitted by the University of Miami Law School, Americans for Immigrant Justice, the Center for Constitutional Rights, Alternative Choice, and Haitian Women of Miami. So next is your issue summary, and this really can be very brief, 2 to 3 pages, paragraphs, not pages, where you highlight your issue, what you're going to talk about in your report, and this is a good place to include facts and figures as highlighted previously. As you can see in this, I apologize if it's a little slow, but here, for example, they talk about how many men have been at the Guantanamo Bay facility, how many have been convicted, that sort of thing, where they're getting exact facts and figures. So another part of your shadow report, or one section, should be to refer to the concluding observations of the committee. If they have any past concluding observations that relate directly to the issue that you're covering in your shadow report, you want to make sure you mention those, or at least footnote those in your report. So another thing you want to do is you want to reference the U.S. government report. If the government doesn't include anything in their report about your issue, you can also mention in your shadow report that the government report is silent on your issue, and you can directly link to the government's report. And it's really helpful if you mention specific paragraph numbers from the government's report so that you can help the committee members and direct them directly to where you're talking about. And the U.S. government report is on the CAT website of the U.S. Human Rights Network. So all those resources are right there for you to use. We also have, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, a shadow report template, which is on the website, and within that template includes links to things like the U.S. government report. So the next section is the legal framework. You want to make sure that you're mentioning the exact relevant articles of CAT that relate to the issue. You don't need to go into depth about how those articles relate, but it's important to mention them and relate them quickly, and also to link to any general comments that the committee might have, or the list of issues, which also is on the U.S. Human Rights Network website. So next is talking about what other UN bodies have recommended. So feel free within your report to mention other bodies. As we said before, the UPR, there might be ICCPR recommendations, the CERD recommendations, or things that especially the Special Rapporteur on Torture, Special Rapporteur has put out a report about your issues, and be sure to mention that within your report. So at the end of your shadow report, you want to take a minute to put a list of recommended questions. And you really want to try to limit it to about 2 to 4 questions. And I would put those questions in the order of priority. As you can see here at this sample list of questions, and they're questions that are posed to the U.S. government itself. There's 4 questions. And then you also want to have suggested recommendations, things that you hope will come out of the committee review. And again, it's really good to put those in your list of priority and to have 2 to 3 recommendations that you can suggest the committee provide to the U.S. government upon its review. And recommendations can include anything from changes to law and policy or practice at the local, state, or federal level. So just to briefly go over what I just talked about, there's a few ways that you can engage in the NGO in the shadow reporting process, and with the CAT review, you can help write a joint shadow report or an individual or organization shadow report. You can join a working group. You should check out the shadow reporting template we have, and you can help with advocacy before, during, and after Geneva. And you can also join the U.S. Human Rights Network Human Rights at Home campaign, which you can find out more on our website, and there'll be a link to it at the end of the presentation. So I think that ends things for me. Thank you very much, and I'll let Claire introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Rebecca. So we thought it might be helpful to try to illustrate this process a little bit by hearing from someone who has engaged with CAT in the past. And so we asked Joey Mogul to share her experience working with the People's Law Office of Chicago and the Midwest Coalition for Human Rights to bring the Chicago police torture cases, which are also known as the Burge torture cases, before the committee. And she'll also discuss kind of what the outcomes of that process were, and just so we can kind of get a better sense for what this looks like and how it can be effective for advocacy on an issue. So go ahead, Joey. Take it away. Are you?
Can you hear?
I just heard you kind of break in and out. Go ahead and try again.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, coming through. Great.
Okay, folks. I just want to apologize. My email makes sounds. I cannot turn it off, so I apologize for the annoying. So if you could go to the first slide. I don't really work with slides, so I'm going to go quickly. In 2006, well, I mean, we had been a group that had been organizing for years before that, working on the Chicago police torture cases that involved the torture of over 110 African-American men and women on Chicago's South Side from 1972 to 1991. And we clearly met the Article 1 definition of torture. Individuals were electrically shocked on their genitals, cattle prods, and electric shock box. Others were suffocated. People were subjected to mock execution. And people were beat with telephone books and rubber hoses. Further, people were subjected to racist terrorism, constantly called racist slurs and epithets throughout their interrogations. We can go to the next slide, please. This is a picture of the electric shock box that Burge and others used. Next slide. So in 2006, there was a wealth of evidence that demonstrated that this torture had occurred. And in fact, Chicago Police Department's own internal system investigations found that the torture was systematic, methodical, and that members of the chain of command were aware of it, but they did not do anything to stop it. And even though we knew this, and it was well known, so to speak, not a single officer had ever been prosecuted for their state, federal, or international crimes of torture, and they enjoyed impunity with respect to these crimes. Next slide, please. 2002, there was a group called Campaign had a special prosecutor appointed. But in 2004, it was very clear that this special prosecutor was not going to hold those responsible accountable for their crimes of torture. That's when the U.S. Human Rights Network and also Black People Against Police Torture decided we had to bring the Burge torture cases from Chicago to the international fora. And next slide, please. So that, we were really fortunate. We were working with folks from the Midwest Coalition for Human Rights who had submitted a very effective and short shadow report to the Burge torture cases as well as tasers. And they cited various, articles of the convention, including Article 12, which was the failure of the U.S. government to investigate and the torture and hold those responsible. Next slide, please. And then we had the opportunity in May of 2006 to go to Geneva, Switzerland, and to present the Chicago police torture cases. And I happened to be the person from our little crew of attorneys, activists, organizers, torture survivors, and family members to go. I got in 24 hours notice that I was going to go. I can kind of discuss in the question and answer period if people want to hear what my adventure was like. I will say, you know, you have a short period of time to present your issue in front of the committee during the NGO formal briefing session that Joe mentioned. And I would highly recommend that if people had an opportunity to have their statements written out, that they do so. But I would not read from the statements when you make those presentations. I did not have a written presentation to give to anyone. I could only just, because I didn't know I was going, and I only did a very short, I believe it was 3-minute presentation. So that caught the ear of some of the members of the Committee Against Torture, and they then raised the issue at the first hearing with the U.S. government delegation, and it got raised at the second hearing of the U.S. delegation. That's important because the issue with respect to the Burge torture cases wasn't the first hearing. It could not be discussed at the second hearing, and it was very unlikely to be included in their final report. Next slide, please. So the committee did hear our cries of injustice with respect to the Burge torture cases, and then after these formal hearings in Geneva, they issued their final report, and they came down on 19th, 2006. I think it's a report that everyone should look at before they draft their shadow reports and should cite to it if possible. I think it was a scathing indictment of the U.S. government's failure to comply with the Convention Against Torture. And not only did the Committee Against Torture issues around Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, but they raised issues, specifically law enforcement officials' impunity on domestic territory in the United States, and they specifically raised the Burge torture cases. Next slide, please. With respect to the Burge torture cases, they noted these limited lack of prosecution in the cases, on the U.S. government promptly, thoroughly, partially investigate all allegations of torture or CID by law enforcement officials. And citing to Article 12, they called on the U.S. government to bring perpetrators to justice. And I think that it's very huge, it was very huge for us to have this moment, because here in Chicago, we had done so much litigating and organizing and demonstrating in the street and demanding that our officials do something about the torture cases. But the fact is that so many of the local politicians were knee-deep in the torture cases and were responsible for either condoning torture or failing to take action. So for us to go to the UN Committee Against Torture and have the UN committee raise this as an issue worthy of worldwide condemnation, as well as talking to the Department of Justice in D.C., it was helpful to us so that we could, so that the local officials here could recognize that we are talking outside of their sphere and recognizing that we're bringing other pressure to bear. Next slide, please. So then on May 19th, the committee's decision came down at 4 a.m. That was important for us to know so that we could try to prepare press materials. We ended up having a court date that very same day, and we presented the findings. And we got major news stories on all our local networks, including our coveted 10 o'clock news stations, and we got coverage in several local, national, and international media outlets, which was both very helpful for us to get the story out about the Burge torture cases and to build support and make connections around torture with other groups working on this worldwide. Next slide, please. It's not worth it, but that's some of you'll see that on the press coverage. Next slide, please. And so the press was also important because it put pressure on our local officials, but we did not stop with just doing organizing around the UN Committee Against Torture's finding. We didn't just work with the press. You know, we took that finding and people prepared petitions, which they sent to the U.S. Attorney's Office, demanding that the federal government take action and prosecute Burge and others for their crimes. There was a march in the streets in 2006 demanding justice in the cases. And then we went and we organized hearings at Chicago City's Council and our Cook County Board. And in fact, we passed resolutions at our Cook County Board the UN Committee Against Torture's finding, which then called on the U.S. Attorney's Office to bring a prosecution and hold Burge and others accountable. Next slide, please. Then we were fortunate in 2008, just 2 years after the Committee Against Torture made its finding in the Burge torture cases, the U.S. Attorney's Office, in conjunction with the Department of Justice, indicted Burge for 2 counts of obstruction of justice and 1 count of perjury. And you know, the factual allegations were that he lied about the torture he and others committed at Area 2 Police headquarters. And subsequently, 2 years later, Burge was found guilty on all 3 counts. Next slide, please. And I can say, you know, I know there are some individuals on this call, and you know, I think that it's, you know, I want to acknowledge that we have some prison abolitionists, and I think of myself as a prison abolitionist, and that the issue around seeking the prosecution of Burge be troubling for some. But I have to say that Burge's conviction has dramatically changed the way the Burge torture survivors and the cases have been treated in the courts and the courts of public opinion. Since Burge's conviction in 2010, there have been several torture survivors who've been freed or exonerated. So right now we still have 20 people who remain behind bars who we're seeking evidentiary hearings for. There have been several cases where people have reached $1 million settlements as a result of the torture and wrongful convictions they suffered, but there are still so many others who have not sought compensation. So I can tell you that Burge's conviction has created a sea change in the way we see the Burge torture cases here in Chicago and the way the politicians and the media deal with these cases, but the struggle continues. Next slide, please. So you know, as a small request to my comrades on this phone call or on this webinar, you know, I want to let you know that our struggle continues for justice in these cases. And specifically, we're seeking a reparations ordinance, and we are seeking that be passed in Chicago City Council. And if you have the opportunity, we'd love if you'd go to our change.org petition and sign on to seek the passage of this ordinance. We're still seeking financial compensation, psychological counseling, and a full other panoply of redress for the Chicago police torture survivors. So with that, I will turn it over to others who can speak much more knowledgeably about this process.
Thanks, Joey. It's always really great to hear from you. It's such a powerful story and a really good example of how advocacy before the committee can be effective. And I definitely encourage everyone to sign the change.org petition if you have a moment right now. Yeah, you can see the link right there. Maybe just copy paste it, or you know what? I can just put it in. I'll just put it in the chat so it's easier to copy paste. So now I'm going to pass it over to Antonio Giannata, who is the Advocacy Director for Human Rights Watch's U.S. program, and he's also the co-chair for the CAT Task Force with me, and he's going to field the Q&A portion of the call, which we have a solid half hour, which is fantastic for Q&A, so hopefully we can get to all your questions. I know there were a few that came up in the chat earlier, and he's been keeping track of those. So hopefully we can get to everyone's questions. You there, Antonio?
I am here. Thank you, Claire, and thank you to the network for making this webinar possible. Thank you, Rebecca, for it being so seamless. Again, I'm Antonio Giannata. I'm the U.S. Program Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch. I'm in Washington, D.C. We do seem to be right on schedule, which is exciting. We have about 25 to 30 minutes for questions. field of questions, but I hopefully don't need to answer all of them. And these are questions for all the presenters. And so if you are, there are two ways to ask questions. You can use the chat function if you're using the web, if you're online. You can also go to My Mood at the top of the screen and raise your hand. And I think someone will flag for me if you have a question, and you'll get unmuted. We can kick this off with the two questions that have already been asked on the chat screen, and I will read them out again. From Carla Torres at the Center for Reproductive Rights. I have a question for Joao. Can he share whether all the committee members will participate in the meeting with civil society on the eve of the U.S. review? I don't know if Joao is back on the phone. Nicole, if you have an answer, that would be helpful. I will give you some information that I know is possible that might help to answer this. Claudio Grossman, the Dean of the Washington College of Law, is the chair of the committee. He's based here at American, based here in D.C. I spoke to him, and it appears to be the committee practice that the committee members recuse themselves in reviews that involve the countries where they reside. So my understanding is that Dean Grossman and also Felice Gare are not going to participate in the review itself. Do any other presenters have more information on this? Okay, then I think that will answer that question for now. And then the second question is from Gizichu from Task International. My question is on Article 1, definition of torture. Torture can be both physical and psychological. However, the definition is not clear what amounts to psychological torture. And I think it may be more of a statement than a question, but yes, you're right. The definition is a bit vague. It's any act that causes severe mental pain or suffering. One interesting aspect of this is to see how the committee defines mental torture versus the state parties that go before it. For example, in the 2006 review of the United States, there was a little bit of a debate about how the U.S. was defining mental, psychological torture, because the U.S. was requiring that there be prolonged mental harm, but the committee disputed that definition and said that the definition should constitute a wider category of acts which cause severe mental suffering, irrespective of prolongation or its duration. Do any other presenters have an answer for Gizichu's question? Great. Oh, all right. Is anybody raising their hands? Rebecca, can you help me out here?
Sure. I think Jan Freswick had a question. Jan, you should be, or Jan, you should be unmuted. We can't hear you if you're speaking. Okay. Does anybody else have a question? And please raise your hand or type it on the side, and we can return back to Jan if he or she is able to unmute their phone. If you're on your computer, if you raise your hand, I can unmute you, which is what I just did. And you just have to make sure your computer volume is turned up so we can hear you. Okay, I think that I let Joa know about that question that Antonio just answered from Carla Torres at the Center for Reproductive Rights, and he may rejoin our call, but he did send me a note to say that all CAT members will participate at the NGO briefing that's done in the plenary of the committee. Does anybody else have a question? Yes.
Hi, Rebecca. Sorry, I'm rejoining.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much.
Do I have a question? Go ahead, Joe.
You're welcome. Yes?
Go ahead.
No, I was just indicating that differently from other treaty bodies, in the case of CAT, the NGO briefing is done in plenary. So as you know, this means that all the members of the committee will participate, despite the fact that it will be a private session. It means that there will be no observers. It will be only the NGOs that have submitted a written report and that have enrolled and asked for the accreditation for the meeting. It means also that there will be interpretation in the official languages and the working languages of the committee, in this case in Spanish, French and English, which allows you to reach all the members of the committee, and I think you have to take advantage of that because irrespective of the fact that you might have the possibility to have a lunch briefing afterwards, lunch briefings are informal and there will be no interpretation. So I think you have to raise the most important issues during the NGO briefing in plenary, because your presentation as well as your answers to the committee's questions will be interpreted into the working language of the committee, which at this moment are French, English and Spanish.
Joao, can you verify some information for me? This is Antonio at Human Rights Watch. With the chair of the committee being Claudio Grossman and with Felice Gayer also being on the committee, will those two members of the committee participate in a review of their own country, or will they recuse themselves? I was under the impression that they would be recusing themselves.
According to the Addis Ababa guidelines, which have been incorporated into the rules of procedure of the committee, the members of the committee may recuse themselves for a long list of reasons. Actually, already in the rules of the procedure of the committee, there are a list of reasons why they should recuse themselves. It means that definitely nationality, one of the members being a national of any country that is before the committee, this member should not participate in the private meetings. However, they will be able to participate in the public meetings without taking the floor, without participating. So they will be present in the room, but will not participate. So in the specific case of the U.S., I think the example that you have given will be applicable, meaning that for the private meetings, they will not participate when they recuse themselves, and for the public meetings, they will be able to be in the meeting room, but they will not actively participate in the meeting.
Thank you, Joao, for that clarification.
Welcome. You're welcome.
I
Any
see.
other question? Yeah.
I see a couple of other questions in the chat function, so I'll read them out. One from Jana Weiss. Is CAT addressing denial of legal capacity based on disability, which the Special Rapporteur on Torture called for abolishing? It's the basis for forced psychiatric torture. I'm going to push this off potentially to any of the other presenters. I'm not familiar if this issue was raised specifically in the list of issues prior to reporting. Is anybody aware of whether this issue was raised in one of the questions by the committee? I think what we should do is, for people who are participating on this, maybe if we can send a link to the list of questions to see if that question was raised so that Jana has her answer. So if anybody can put a link to the list of issues prior to reporting in the chat function, that would be really helpful. Thank you. Okay, Joao, if considering the NGO briefings are quite short, especially for such a large delegation as coming from the United States, if we want to do direct follow-up with committee members who might be particularly interested in a certain issue, is there a way that you would recommend us to determine who we should reach out to, or should we go to the rapporteur for our issue? What do you advise on on reaching out to individual committee members?
Yes, indeed, this is a very important question. Just to complement my previous answer, I want to indicate that the rules of procedure, which have been updated very recently to include those issues about conflict of interest, are available on the website, so you can consult them. On this specific issue, I would say that as the committee dedicates in plenary 1-hour meeting for the NGOs, in general, I would say that the committee is not very keen to have lunch briefings. However, when there were very large NGO representatives, which I think it will be the case for the US, and the committee has actually agreed to have lunch briefings. So that might be a possibility. However, I think the best thing will be for you to get in touch with OMCT, who has been coordinating those briefings, to see who will participate and to set an exact time for us to inform the committee about this possibility. Differently from the plenary, those meetings might not be attended by all members. Definitely, usually the rapporteurs will attend, but the other members will be on a voluntary basis. I guess that due to the interest, most, if not all, members would participate. As to additional information that you might want to submit to the committee members or to the rapporteur, this can be done in writing at any moment. Again, I think one of the presenters has mentioned that the important is not the quantity of information that you will be submitting, but the fact that they must be very clear, because the amount of reports that the members and the rapporteurs of the committee will receive during a session is very, very extensive. I mean, if you just imagine there are about 8 states that will be before the committee. If you look at an average of 2 or 3 reports per state party, and some reports will be probably quite short, like 20 or 30 or 40 pages, but others are much, much longer. We're looking at much more than 2,000 or 3,000 pages for the members to read. So you understand that information provided at a late stage will not be as considered as it will be submitted in advance. And this is also to complement the fact that don't wait for the last moment of the 2-week deadline for the submission of documents, but try to submit it as early as possible, because that is in your interest for the rapporteur and for the members in general to be able to analyze and to look into the information that you will be providing. Another possibility also is, as not all the members of the committee are English speaking or are fluent in English, is to submit executive summary of your reports in French. The majority of the members of the committee will be able to read your report in English, but some won't. And if you want to reach out for all the members of the committee, I think a small executive summary of the submission in French will be welcomed by those 2 members that will not be able to fully understand and fully read a long report in English.
Thank you, Joel. We have another question from Cynthia Totten at Just Attention International. This is a question more for Claire and for me, and for the CAT task force in general. If the issues you wish to raise with the committee are highly pertinent to several of the U.S. Human Rights Network's working groups, should you be part of several working groups and give input to all of the shadow reports? Claire, I'll take a first shot at this. I mean, I think that there is going to be clearly situations where issues cross over between working groups. And so I do think that communication between working groups and with each of the sort of heads of these working groups is a good idea, just to make sure that the issue do you agree with me, Claire?
Yeah, I think we've been aware since the beginning of of building these working groups that there is overlap between the working groups, but we wanted to have the breadth that we do because we see it as very important to make sure we have covered all the issues raised in the list of issues and all of the issues that we as a civil society community think are important. So we're trying to be thorough, but then it kind of raises this conflict about overlap, and we are just going to kind of work on dealing with the overlap issue on a kind of like on a step-by-step basis as we move towards the session. I think my recommendation would be to join the working group that you think is the best fit. And I know that might not be really an easy question for everyone to answer. But then what I don't want is for people to be stretched too thin and in, 4 different working groups, but not really able to participate in a meaningful way to any of them. I know that's a lot to ask of people, and probably doesn't sound. It might in the end make it so that you're not able to contribute in the way that you want to be able to, and we can't hear from you in as an effective way as possible. So then I think what we can do is once you've joined that specific working group, make sure that you're continuing to articulate the information that you have that's relevant to other working groups in the context of the working group that you've joined, and we can help facilitate the process of communication between the working groups to make sure that, even if you've joined, for example, issues affecting youth, if that's the working group you're in, we can help articulate, kind of help facilitate communication between that group and the other relevant groups. Say you specifically are interested in issues affecting young women, and then we would want to make sure to get that information that you have over to the other working group on issues affecting women and LGBTQ individuals. So that's kind of an example for how potentially that could work.
Claire, I agree with you. I think that's a good format, and the CAT task force and the working groups report out every couple of weeks on phone calls as to what they're working on, and that's the great opportunity to deal with any kind of overlap to make sure that it's covered appropriately. Any other questions, Rebecca? Anybody raising their hands? I don't see anything more in the chat group.
I don't see any other hands raised at this point either. Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Rebecca.
Antonio, unless you have a few words, I just have a few things to close up. But
please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, Antonio, for facilitating. And thank you to all of our presenters. You were all really wonderful, and I think this webinar was very informative. So just a few things to go over in terms of resources that the U.S. Human Rights Network has to help you with your CAT advocacy and shadow reporting. You can go to our website where all of these are listed, and I'm also putting it up on the side so you have the link right there. And you'll find the U.S. government report there. You'll find the list of issues. You'll find the shadow report template. You'll find a CAT fact sheet. You'll find the general comments, the CAT committee concluding observations, and the U.S. government response to the 2006 concluding observations. And we'll also be putting up some sample shadow reports as well, and those will be probably from other treaty bodies, but they'll still be very informative of kind of give you a sense of what you should be doing while you're writing your shadow report. So just one more quick plug to please, if you're interested, join a working group. Again, that list is up on our website. If you want to write or contribute to a shadow report, reach out to your allies, reach out to us. And the deadline for submitting to the U.S. Human Rights Network is September 17th. As others have mentioned, the deadline for submitting to the CAT Secretariat is October 17th. However, they've asked us to submit the reports early because that's only 2 weeks before the actual review starts. So if you submit through the network, we'll put together an executive summary. We'll also translate it into French and send off hard copies to Geneva itself. Here's another plug to please join our CAT listserv. We put a lot of the information, especially moving forward as the shadow reporting and working groups really get started. All the information about the advocacy for CAT will be there. And one final plug to become a member of the U.S. Human Rights Network. So unless there are any final questions, and also if folks have questions after the fact, they can feel free to email that cat@ushrnetwork.org email address, and we'll try to answer them afterwards. And we will be sending out a copy of both the PowerPoint and the webinar itself, a recording of the webinar to everyone, and those will also be on our website. And so I just once again want to thank all of our presenters. I thought they were really fabulous. They took a lot of time to put this together, and they gave us really informative information. And so thank you all, and thank you so much to the CAT Task Force and the CAT Task Force co-chairs, Antonio and Claire. And have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining. It was very helpful.
You're welcome. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.